Good day. Yesterday, the last 24 hours have been an unusually quiet day in terms of the war in Ukraine. There's been little news of offensives by either side. That's not to say that fighting isn't going on all the time. Of course it is. But there's been no sign of any fundamental changes on the front lines. Nor did we see any repeats of the major Russian missile offensives that we've seen over the last few weeks since the beginning of October. As I've discussed in the past, that is the Russian pattern. They launch missile strikes, they then pause, see what the Ukrainians are going to do. When the Ukrainians are gradually making some progress in putting their infrastructure back together again, then the Russians launch another massive missile strike, putting the Ukrainians back at square one. And I predict that this is the pattern that's going to continue for the rest of the winter, and indeed until this war is concluded. Meanwhile, even as things remain relatively quiet on the military fronts, Ukraine, President Zelensky received a visitor who was Prime Minister Rishi Sunak of Great Britain. Now, as my colleague Alex Christoforou has pointed out, it's a curious fact that when Zelensky goes off script in some way, either by appearing to come to some kind of an agreement with the Russians, as he very nearly did in March, and what tends to happen is that the British Prime Minister, whoever he is, Boris Johnson, or now it's Sunak, turns up in Kiev. In the case of the diplomatic breakthrough in March, Boris Johnson turned up in Kiev, and his job was to tell Zelensky to backtrack, to reverse the moves that he had made towards a negotiated settlement with the Russians. This time, I can't help but think that it's related to the missile attack, the missile strike on Poland. There was this Ukrainian missile strike. It was, my own view remains that this was a mistake, that this was a case of the Ukrainians trying to launch an air defense missile to shoot down a Russian cruise missile, and the missile going astray and landing in Poland instead. Though, needless to say, there's been no full investigation of the incident, and nor will there be. Anyway, Ukrainian officials, President Zelensky himself, instead of admitting the fact that it was indeed one of their missiles that landed in Poland, spent days insisting that it was a Russian missile that hit Poland instead. And there's been more and more information that the Western governments have been extremely annoyed by Zelensky and his insistence that, in fact, it was a Russian missile. In fact, as has been widely known, there was an article in the Financial Times in which it said that the Ukrainian position was ridiculous, that the Ukrainians were clearly lying, that they were destroying confidence in themselves, and by lying in this egregious way. And, of course, the commentator, the British commentator, I assume it was a British official talking to the Financial Times, went on to say that the Ukrainians have done more harm to themselves through their lies than they did as a result of this missile which fell on Poland. The damage done by the missile was less than Ukraine's demolition of the trust Western governments have in it through Ukraine's persistent lying about this incident. By the way, I have to say, I do find that a rather strange comment, given that the missile actually killed 2 people. But I'm going to put that aside. Anyway, the Ukrainians are still, as far as I know, insisting that it was a Russian missile. And sure enough, the British Prime Minister is sent to Kiev to discuss, well, what precisely? Now, this is a strange visit because, first of all, it was very low key. When Boris Johnson used to go to Kiev, British media used to cover his visits to Kiev extensively, and it was clear that he and Zelensky had developed an intense personal bond, and that Zelensky and Johnson had become friends in some sort of strange way. And then, of course, Liz Truss, during that very brief period that she was Prime Minister, she also had her contacts with Zelensky. And again, these were treated with great publicity. They attracted a lot of interest and attention. Well, Sunak's visit did attract some attention. I mean, the British media did cover it. And it was briefly, I noticed, the lead story in the BBC. But it was not anything like the sort of intense visit, intense publicity that Johnson's visits to Kiev used to get. And the other thing that was strange about this visit is that there's been very little information about what Sunak and Zelensky talked about with each other. There's been very little information about this. Sunak did come with another arms package, but it was small, £150 million, which in this war is, to be straightforward about it, it's peanuts. And as far as I could tell, it was about radars and cannon, which were supposedly going to help the Ukrainians shoot down Russian cruise missiles. If you believe that, if you believe that this British equipment is going to make any difference in the missile war, then I'm afraid I have a bridge to sell you. It's not going to make any difference at all. So Sunak couldn't come to Kiev empty-handed. If he'd turned up in Kiev without some goodies, then that would have been news, and it would have been seen around the world, and indeed in Britain itself, and certainly in Ukraine, as a sign that relations between Britain and Ukraine were deteriorating in some way. So he had to come up with something, but what he came up with was pretty minimalist. By the way, given the very difficult economic situation in Britain, given the fact that the British government is raising taxes to the highest level they've been since the 1940s, given that Britain is experiencing a fall in living standards faster than any is experienced again since the 1940s, and given that the British government is projecting cuts in public spending, I doubt very much that there will be very much more economic and military aid from London heading Ukraine's way. I think if the British populace were to get the sense that the British government was prioritising Ukraine over themselves, that would not go down well, and the Conservatives, with a very difficult election coming in 2 years' time, I think are unlikely to take those kind of political risks. But all right, I mean, Sunak came to Kiev, he made the usual ritual comments about Russians, about Britain supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes. But what exactly did he tell Zelensky? Well, we don't know. And one of the strange things is that there's been very, very little information about what actually went on between Zelensky and Sunak. But what we can say is this: after Sunak's visit, the Ukrainian officials started to talk about the fact that they were coming under pressure to negotiate with the Russians, and they seemed to be speaking again in ways that looked like they were intended to pour cold water on the idea that they should negotiate with the Russians. So Zelensky made a public comments on Friday in which he said that if there was a agreement with the Russians, a ceasefire agreement now, it would only last for a short time, that the Russians would simply reorganize and rebuild their forces, which, by the way, they're actually doing, and would resume an offensive very soon, so that Ukraine would lose as a result of any negotiations with the Russians. Another Ukrainian official has spoken about the fact that Ukraine negotiating with Russia now would amount to Ukraine's capitulation. And other Ukrainian officials have spoken about how it would be illogical for Ukraine to negotiate at a time when supposedly they've been achieving battlefield victories. Now, the fact that the Ukrainians are talking in this way, that they're talking about the illogic of negotiations and all those sort of things, leads me to think, this is my own view and my own assessment, that Sunak actually came and told the Ukrainians that they were not going to get a black check. He probably didn't tell them that they must negotiate with the Russians now, but he probably did tell them that negotiations, a negotiated solution to the war, is the only practical outcome. Now, I doubt, as I said, that he twisted any arms. He probably didn't tell he certainly wouldn't have told the Ukrainians that they must negotiate or lose British support. That would be politically impossible for Sunak to do at this time. But the very fact that Sunak and Zelensky, what they said to each other, is not being much talked about. In fact, we've had virtually no information about what the two said to each other. That makes me think that it was not something that the Ukrainians particularly wanted to hear, and it's not something either that Sunak at the moment wants to publicise too much, given the head of steam that still exists within the British establishment in support of Ukraine. So I think that Sunak came to Kiev with two purposes. Firstly, basically to tell the Ukrainians to stop lying about the missile that hit Poland and not to do something like that ever again. And secondly, as I said, I think he made it clear to the Ukrainians that the days of unlimited Western, or at least British support for Ukraine may be coming to an end. That's my own personal view, and if so, it's dictated by internal British political dynamics. To be frank, I've never got the impression that Sunak personally, the British Prime Minister, is as interested or as committed to the Ukraine war, certainly as Boris Johnson was, or even as Liz Truss was. He's been reasonably quiet. What he has said about Ukraine and about the war there is the kind of thing that all British politicians at the moment say, and I don't think he's gone beyond that particular script. Anyway, that was the Sunak message to Ukraine. There was a meeting, some sort of a meeting in Halifax in the United States, which was addressed by General Austin, Lloyd Austin, the US Defense Secretary. And it was, by the way, in addressing this meeting that Zelensky apparently said that a negotiation now with the Russians, a truce now with the Russians, would only be short-lived and would therefore not be would be contrary to Ukrainian interests. But Lloyd Austin also spoke, and I found what he said actually quite interesting. Now, again, I've widely taken the view that Lloyd Austin is not the sharpest amongst US defense secretaries. He's a sort of very loyal functionary of the Biden administration. He follows its policy. He did, however, say some quite interesting things. He said, for example, that the Russians have a very powerful army and very, very impressive weapons. I would be quite interested to know what those impressive weapons are. I'm going to discuss this briefly in a moment, and I'm going to talk about some of the things that I think that Lloyd Austin is thinking about when he talks about these impressive weapons that the Russians have. But he also said something else, which I found extremely interesting. He said that the war in Ukraine is going to shape the contours of the rest of the 21st century. Now, it's very common when wars begin, and as they continue, for people to talk them up, to talk increasingly that these wars are really important in order to justify continuing with the wars. There's usually a kind of inflation in expectations about what victory will achieve and what defeat might result in. You see this to some extent on the Russian side, and I'm going to come to that in a moment with some of the comments that the Russian Deputy Chair of the Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, has said. But let's focus on Austin. Austin talks about how this war in Ukraine is going to shape the future of the 21st century. And this comes shortly after Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, said that a defeat for Ukraine would be a defeat for NATO. And it seemed to me that Austin's words were of a similar type. They suggest that if the Russians achieve their objectives in Ukraine, then this will somehow seal the decline of the West. That was my overall impression of what Austin was saying. Now, if I'm right about that, and I'm pretty sure I am, then I think it perhaps is incumbent upon people like Austin and other officials in the US government to ask themselves how they got the United States into this situation. Because, as I have repeatedly said in program after program, a defeat for Ukraine is the most likely outcome. In fact, it is the only likely outcome eventually in this war. Ukraine may regain some ground in places like Kharkiv and in Kherson. Kherson region, by the way, is now looking like a poisoned gift that General Surovikin, the Russian commander-in-chief, has handed to Ukraine. I spoke in my previous program about how Ukraine's control of Kherson region seems to be extremely shaky, how Ukrainian forces in Kherson region are coming under continuous Russian artillery and missile and airstrikes, so that Ukraine continues to lose troops and forces in Kherson. And it's now becoming increasingly clear that the Ukrainians are finding it impossible to keep Kherson city itself properly supplied with water, energy, even food, given that the Russians are just a kilometer away across the river and are able to shell communications to Kherson city at any time. And indeed, the Ukrainian government has now done exactly the same as what the Russian authorities did when they were in control of Kherson city. The Ukrainians are now saying that they want the people of Kherson city to leave. They want to organize their own voluntary evacuation of whoever is left in Kherson city, because apparently this place can't be supplied or protected given the close proximity of the Russians a kilometer away across the river. So, given this, given the fact, as I said, that the Ukrainians can recover territory, but it doesn't really mean very much. They continue to suffer huge losses every day. Every day I read more assessments of the very heavy losses that Ukraine is suffering. Their energy system is gradually collapsing, their economy is gradually collapsing together with their energy system. Ukrainian officials again spoke today about the fact that anybody who could leave the cities, go somewhere, should do so, because it's going to become supposedly increasingly difficult to sustain life in the cities. Given that all this is so, given that, as I said, Ukraine has no path that I can see towards victory. I'm not even sure what victory is. I'll come in a moment to what Medvedev was saying about this. Given that this is the reality of the situation in Ukraine, given that the US's ability to keep sending arms supplies to Ukraine, as Secretary Austin undoubtedly knows, is beginning to run down. We've just seen the dribble of weapons that Sunak promised to Ukraine when he was there, weapons that are not going to make any fundamental difference to the military situation, indeed any difference at all to the military situation. Given that all this is so, how is it that Austin comes along and tells us that this war, this commitment to Ukraine is important? Because if Russia wins, if Ukraine loses, well, that will shape the 21st century in ways that presumably would not be favorable to the United States and to the Western powers. After all, it was a former US President, Barack Obama, who pointed out correctly that in Ukraine, the Russians always possess escalatory dominance. And if I can again come back to the military situation, with every day I read of more Russian forces now gradually becoming integrated, these reservist forces becoming integrated into the Russian forces, the Russian military in Ukraine itself, these 300,000 reservists becoming involved. In fact, there's even been film which shows that some reservists have now been used, ex-paratroopers have been used to create a new air mobile unit. In other words, the paratroop forces are being withdrawn. And though I'm not in any way going to make any assumptions or claims about this, I've actually seen pictures now of what appear to be reservists training alongside Russian Armata tanks. This is this new Russian tank with its automated turret that the Russians demonstrated back in 2015. Or perhaps finally it's going to be used in action. Who knows? I've no idea. But anyway, the fact is that the Russians have shown that they do have escalatory dominance. They're building up their army, their military in Ukraine. They're parrying all these Ukrainian offensives and all of these attacks. And a Ukrainian official today has actually admitted that the Russians seem to be working towards a major offensive in the winter with this huge Russian build-up that's going on. So Russia has escalatory dominance in Ukraine, and Barack Obama, the President of the United States, as he then was, recognized that fact in 2016 when he gave an interview to The Atlantic. In fact, Obama was so well aware of the fact that Russia had escalatory dominance in Ukraine that whilst he was president, he actually prohibited the supply of weapons to Ukraine, a policy, by the way, that was reversed after Donald Trump was elected. So, Austin knows, because he's a military person, as I said, he may not be the brightest knife in the drawer, but he knows that the Russians have escalatory dominance. He knows that the US's ability to keep Ukraine supplied with weapons is diminishing. He must know a lot about Ukraine's situation, the fact that its energy system is breaking down, that its economy is in crisis, that its army is slowly diminishing in size, that the US is incapable of providing it with more supplies. And there's also now growing reports, by the way, that the communication system that Ukraine relies on, the Starlink system, is also now suffering from increasing problems, either because Elon Musk is dialing it down, or more plausibly because the Russians are jamming it ever more successfully. So Austin knows all of this. And as I've said, it was known all those years ago, 6 years ago, back in 2016, when Barack Obama said as much, back in that interview he gave with The Atlantic in 2016, that the Russians possess escalatory dominance in Ukraine. So, how did the United States, how did the West become involved in a conflict in Ukraine? If the stakes in this conflict are as high as General Austin says. Now, it seems to me that what Austin is doing, even if he probably doesn't realize this himself, is he is pointing to a catastrophic failure of Western policy, of Western policy making. The United States, the Western powers, have got themselves trapped in a conflict in Ukraine, which the Ukrainians are going to eventually lose. All the accumulation of evidence ultimately points in that direction. And yet they tell us at the same time that if the Ukrainians lose, it will shape the 21st century, extrapolating from Austin's words, in negative terms. And we can already see some of that happening. We can already see how the global south, those countries that are essentially non-aligned, have made little secret of the fact that they are more sympathetic to the Russians in this conflict than they are to the West. In fact, a French businessman who recently visited India came back and said that he was astonished when he went to India and to the Middle East and met his business partners there, that these people were telling him, these Indian and Arab business people were telling them, how did you ever let yourselves in the West get yourselves into this situation? How did you get yourselves into this mess in Ukraine, where you are supporting the party that is going to eventually lose, and when you've embarked upon this sanctions war with the Russians that you are also inevitably and eventually going to lose. And one can understand very well the position, the point of view of these Indian and Arab business people. Whilst I'm on the subject, on the topic of the economic war, I'm going to say that we've now had extremely optimistic comments about the Russian economy from Russia's Deputy Prime Minister, First Deputy Prime Minister, Andrei Belousov, who is the person who has overall oversight over the conduct of the economy, the entire economy. He gave a press briefing on the sidelines of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, at which, by the way, he's heading the Russian delegation. And I'm going to quote his words because they are perhaps the clearest indicator of where the situation is, how both with the Russian economy and indeed with the Russian economy's place in the world. And this is what Belousov is reported to have said. This comes from the Russian Interfax news agency. We're coming out fairly consistently this year in terms of GDP dynamics. Decline will be somewhere in the region of -3 to -2.9, -2.8 approximately. We believe that we can keep to a 1% decline next year. According to our estimates, the Russian economy has bottomed out in terms of consumer demand, not yet in terms of investments, but we're getting somewhere closer. Two indicators, in fact, show that business is also at the development of the situation fairly optimistically. That's PMI, that's to say indicators about people's opinions, business people's opinions about the future of the economy. Continuing with what Belousov said, that's PMI first of all, which for us is conventionally over 50%. And secondly, it's the very low level of unemployment, very high employment, which is even with unemployment even below 4%. Therefore, this all speaks to the situation being quite favorable. And then Belousov contrasts this situation with the situation in Europe. As concerns Europe, the situation is different there. It needs to be understood that it's not just about recession. Recession is a certain consequence. The fact is that markets have shifted, and they've been shifting since 2021. At that, you and I remember how prices for metals, relative prices for metal, doubled, and everyone was guessing, is this a temporary phenomenon or not? The shifting of markets, it creates a very high level of uncertainty for European producers. No one can currently organize long-term plans, and plus high inflation with the need to tighten monetary and fiscal policy overlaps with this. Plus, the debt problem hasn't gone anywhere. The combination of factors creates, of course, a very large threat to the stability of the economy, first and foremost to the countries of the EU, Southern Europe, and pretty much already Germany as well. Everything is much more stable for us in that regard here in Russia. Russia, as strange as it may seem, is now perhaps an island of stability under sanctions in this sense. It's easier to project events here than in the world. Russia, an economic island of stability. Who would have thought it? And yet, it seems to me that Belousov is not really wrong. I mean, he's describing the situation as it is. I mean, read any British newspaper and you get the sense of that. Germany is now talking about blackouts in January and February, that there will have to be short blackouts. No explanation of what goes on after the winter has ended, when, of course, no more Russian gas comes. But it does look as if Belousov is giving a fair summary of the economic situation in Europe as well as in his own country. And he says Russia is now an island of stability, whereas in Europe, the situation is now so bad, with prices so unstable, with energy prices so high, with inflation so high, that it is becoming impossible for people to plan there, for business people to plan there. So, from every conceivable point of view, things are not turning out well. So, come back to General Austin's comments. This war is going to shape the 21st century. We already see, as I said, how it is shaping the 21st century and not in favor of the West. Now, surely, given that all of this was predictable, Obama talked about the fact that the Russians have, in military terms, escalatory dominance in Ukraine. A proper, realistic assessment of the Russian economy would have acknowledged the fact that it is enormously resource rich, that gives it tremendous ability to withstand sanctions pressure, that on trying to impose sanctions, engage the Russians in an economic war, is by contrast going to do serious damage to Western economies. Well, all of that surely ought to have been predictable. So, I come back to my point. Surely what Austin is talking about, what he ought to be acknowledging, is a massive failure in Western policy. How much better would it have been if the Minsk agreement had in fact been implemented? That, after all, provided the route to peace, internal peace in Ukraine. How much better also if this time last year, when the Russians were putting forward draft treaties to block further Western expansion Eastern expansion of NATO into what was clearly Ukraine. How much better if the Western powers, if the United States, if President Biden had come along and had said to the Russians, right, we understand that Ukraine is for you a red line. We want to make it absolutely clear that we have no intention ever of expanding NATO into Ukraine. We acknowledge the fact that Ukraine is a neutral state and will remain so. Surely, far better to have done those two things: implement the Minsk Accord, rule out NATO expansion into Ukraine, try to close this Ukraine crisis down, then be in the situation we are in today, where Ukraine is gradually falling apart economically, suffering massive losses militarily, unsustainable losses militarily, and where this long war, this war of attrition that the Russians, General Surovikin and co, are now waging against Ukraine, will eventually, at some point, grind them down with all the bad political and diplomatic outcomes for the West, for the collective West, that Austin and Stoltenberg are talking about. Surely, real statesmen, real political leaders would have been able to see a little far down the road, would have seen that getting involved, getting drawn into this conflict in Ukraine, of all places, was not in the West's interests, that preserving a relationship with Russia absolutely was, and that doesn't mean being necessarily friends with the Russians, by the way, but maintaining some kind of stable situation in Europe was, and that Western policy, before the war began, should have been focused on that objective. Well, we are where we are. We have a war. We have a war going on in Ukraine. We have an economic war which is being waged against the Russians, and which it's clear that the Russians are, well, I'm going to say it, they're winning. I mean, they are coming through, as Belarus have said, with their economy intact, with their economy, in fact, likely to start growing before very long. And whereas here in Britain, well, if you open the newspapers on any particular day, the level of gloom about our economic prospects is becoming almost apocalyptic. So, we are, as I said, where we are. Surely the right thing to do, therefore, is to try to find a way out, trying to be much more forthright with Zelensky than perhaps Sunak and co are being when they go to Kiev and tell Zelensky, well, perhaps, just possibly, maybe, when you're minded, when you feel like it, we would quite appreciate if you started some kind of negotiations with the Russians. But of course, it's entirely up to you to decide when that happens. I mean, talking to Zelensky in that form isn't going to work. And I'm going to say here that the Russian Deputy Chair of the Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, has been again on a roll once more. And he's published two very interesting comments on his Telegram channel. And exactly what Medvedev's role in the military side of things is in Russia, the policy side of things in Russia is exactly nowadays. It's difficult to judge. But he is a very senior official of the Russian government, deputy chair of the Security Council. And he is, of course, a former president and prime minister. And I can't help but think that these things that he publishes on his Telegram channel have the stamp of approval of the Russian leadership. The first comment that Medvedev said was, well, Zelensky himself is in a trap, and so are the Western powers, because the Western powers, on the one hand, they don't want to get drawn into a World War III type scenario with Russia. They don't want to break completely all their relations with Russia. They're starting to see that this conflict in Ukraine is becoming a major problem for them. And the affair of the Ukrainian missile landing in Poland and Ukraine's desperate lobbying to try to get the West to accept that it was a Russian missile and to get the West to take some kind of military action in response, some kind of action in response under the provisions of Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. Well, that will have shown to the Western powers what an erratic and irresponsible government they are supporting in Kiev. So, on the one hand, the West wants some kind of a compromise. But Zelensky himself can never agree to it. Because if he comes forward, if he starts negotiations with the Russians, he knows perfectly well that that will be that will result in the partitioning of Ukraine. In other words, the loss by Ukraine of major territories in the east. And I suspect, by the way, that the Russians know that if more territories do indeed, as a result of this war, break away from Ukraine, if Ukraine is forced to accept the loss of more territories, Zaporozhye, Kherson, the Donbass, then it will only be one stage in the progressive collapse of Ukraine. Other Russian-speaking regions will at some point also start to press for secession from Ukraine at some point thereafter. So that would be the result, though, of negotiations. Zelensky knows perfectly well that if he were to start negotiations, he would face the likelihood of partition. And then Medvedev went on to say that that kind of outcome, the partitioning of Ukraine, will be rejected by the hardline nationalists who essentially control Ukraine's security forces and, by the way, its armed forces, and that Zelensky himself, who is terrified of these people, this is Medvedev's assessment, that Zelensky himself would not, his future, his fate would hang by a thread if he were ever to make concessions like that. So for that reason, Medvedev says that Zelensky is in a position, a chess position, where any move he makes, whether to continue the war or whether to enter to negotiations, ultimately leaves him weaker. But overall, the one thing he can't face doing is entering into negotiations of his own volition. And the other comment that Medvedev made, and he's made it over the course of today, by the way, even as I'm making this program, is that Medvedev has picked up on some of these somewhat boastful claims some Ukrainian officials are making, that they will recapture Crimea eventually. And Medvedev says this isn't going to happen, obviously. And if you want to talk about historical and ethnic affinities, we'll look at Kiev itself, formerly the capital of ancient Russia, Kiev and Rus, a important city in both the Russian Empire and in the Soviet Union, a city where most people speak Russian and where Russian is the commonly spoken language. And Medvedev didn't say that the Russian objective would eventually be to take control of Kiev, but he left that idea hanging there, as if eventually the Ukrainian state might end with Kiev and all of the Russian-speaking regions of Ukraine and Orthodox regions of Ukraine reverting back to their historic position as part of a greater Russia. Well, on the last point, maybe Medvedev was trolling, but I would remind people that it was not so long ago that Putin, when asked over the course of a press conference whether he anticipated that a Ukrainian state would survive this war, Putin said that it had not been the Russian intention to put the Ukrainian state in jeopardy when they started the special military operation back in February. But Putin seemed to leave open the idea by making all those comments in the past tense that eventually, at some point, maybe the Ukrainian state, as it now exists, might not survive this war. So maybe Medvedev, as he often does, is just enlarging little on the unspoken words that his boss Putin has left floating there. So that's where we are. We are looking at a situation where the Russians are engaging in this build-up. Their economy, as I said, is stable. They're talking about it being an island of stability by comparison with the West. As I said, they've secured their international position. They've built strong relations with China, India, Turkey, Iran, and other countries. They've seen their friend Lula da Silva become president of Brazil again. They've even seen Benjamin Netanyahu, a person with whom they've had historically friendly relations, return to the office of Prime Minister of Israel. And of course, they've also got now good relations with the Saudis. So I come back again to Lloyd Austin's comment. if his words about how important this war is in shaping the future of the 21st century, if he really believes that, then he should surely be asking himself and other members of the administration two questions. Firstly, the question I asked, how did the West get itself into this mess in the first place? Why has it allowed itself to be maneuvered into a conflict in Ukraine where it is supporting Ukraine even as Ukraine is predestined eventually to lose? Surely that's the first question that Austin should be asking. He should be asking it specifically, it seems to me, of the neocons, of the hardliners in the State Department. He should be putting it to them directly. How did you ever lead us into this kind of mess? Why are you putting us in this position? Apparently, General Milley, the US chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is telling everybody there need to be negotiations. And it's the hardliners, the neocon-aligned officials, people like Blinken and Sullivan, who are pushing back. Well, perhaps Austin needs to be a bit more forthright and say to them, well, look, you've got us into this mess. How did you let it happen? That's the first question Austin should be asking. And then the next question is, how do we get out? How do we find a way out of this war? And because if this war goes on and the Ukrainians lose, then the future of the 21st century will be shaped, but not at all to our advantage, not to the advantage of the United States. Well, the answer is, of course, despite all the problems that Zelensky would face if there were negotiations, there have to be negotiations. Medvedev is absolutely right that Zelensky himself is now far too committed to this war. His position is far too vulnerable to pressure from the hardliners around him for him to change course by himself. The only way that can happen is if the Western powers, instead of telling Zelensky, well, you've got to negotiate at some point. You can't expect that we're going to give you a blank check indefinitely. What they've got to do is that they've got to come along and tell Zelensky, you must negotiate now. And they must tell all the other officials, top officials in the Ukrainian power structure, people like General Zaluzhny, that unless Ukraine begins negotiations now and accepts the partition, which is now inevitable, then Western aid to Ukraine will be cut off. That is what Western leaders need to do. Now, I don't think they're going to do it, not for the moment. I know that Ukraine, as I said, is going to enter into negotiations. That means that at some point over the next couple of months, the situation in Ukraine is going to take a decisive and very, very bad turn for the West and for Ukraine as well. And then I'm going to say what I think is going to happen. I think what will then happen is that the United States will do what it did over the course of the Vietnam and Afghanistan wars. It's going to cut Ukraine out. It's going to start negotiating directly with Moscow. And that will be the moment when the Russians will start to dictate terms. But anyway, this is what I want to discuss today. It seems to me that Austin's comments beg important questions. Sunak's visit to Kiev begs many questions as well. I get the sense, I spoke in a program a few days ago, that the Western powers are starting to get weary of this war, that the war has not turned out as they expected, that the neocon assumption that the sanctions would cause the Russian economy to collapse like a house of cards and lead to regime change in Moscow have not been fulfilled, and that the West is now trapped in an endless war that is going hideously wrong for them, and which eventually is going to end in a clear-cut Western defeat in Ukraine and a Russian victory. Statesmanship was in avoiding that entirely predictable outcome, but it wasn't applied. Statesmanship now is in recognizing that reality and trying to find a way out. I'm afraid I don't think that the present political leaders in the West have the credibility to do this. It will require a new administration in Washington. It might require new governments in the major European states. But eventually, that acceptance of reality will come. And the fact that even now there is this growing sense of Ukraine fatigue beginning to gain hold across the West is confirmation of that. Well, this has been a somewhat analytical video. As I said, there's not been very much to talk about on the battlefronts, but Sunak's visit to Kiev, as I said, does beg questions, and Austin's comments in Halifax beg more questions too. And I hope, anyway, you've learned something from this video, found it useful, and thank you for joining me again today, and I look forward to you joining me again soon in future programs. And remember, you can find all our videos on Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and of course Telegram. And remember also that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buying yourself the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all of those great things. And it only remains for me to wish you a very good day, and also to remind you, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.